listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Ha! Intelligent Talk. Have I got you all fooled? All right, folks. Welcome to the program tonight. It's Tuesday evening. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to or watching the Intrepid radio program. And we usually broadcast right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. Come on over, see all the goodness that's Odyssey Radio. You can look at the schedule there, and you can see all the different times throughout the day that this show will play. They play the evening show, and then they repeat it the next morning and afternoon until the next day's show. And, of course, because we're not broadcasting live on the network right now, they are broadcasting all the archives, or well, not all of them. They're running through them. We've got about 500 shows archived over at Odyssey Radio from the last 2 years. If you can imagine, somebody could do the math on that. We do a show 5 nights a week, plus our Sunday show, but we don't usually broadcast. Well, we never broadcast the Sunday show through Odyssey, so let's stick with the 5 days a week. So 5 shows a week times 52 weeks a year times almost 2 years. Well, about 20 months that we've been, 22 months we've been broadcasting over on Odyssey. And that's the number of archived shows that they have over there, give or take 1 or 2 when I would skip a night or take a vacation. And so we are broadcasting tonight from the Makeshift Studio down in Louisiana. And I call it makeshift because I'm away from my home studio. I do not have my professional soundboards. I do not have my professional broadcasting microphones. I do not have my regular stuff around me. And so this is makeshift. And you can see I'm living in a camper right now where I've been for the last 3 months and will be at least for another month or so down in the no man's land of Lake Charles, Louisiana. And where it's starting to get humid. It was very humid outside today. And so those of you, by the way, who are catching this in an archive, not you listening live right now, of course, it would be those who are catching this another time. If you're not hearing it on my YouTube channel, be sure to go over to youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. That is the YouTube channel where you can hear this. And the chat room is starting to go live tonight. And, well, it has been live since it started. It's starting to get livelier. More and more people are coming in. I want to say good evening. This is the nice thing, again, about being in a live mode is that I can say good evening to all of those of you who are here. Teresa Dentone, good to see you here. Elder Barry, nice to have you. Julianne Payne, nice to have you here tonight. And I'm going down my list here, and I'm seeing my son Sam just said hi to everybody. And he's walking through and out. He is spending time with the Mexicans next door, and they're playing something like rum pong or something. That's where they set tables. They play ping pong back and forth on a table, a bunch of them, and you have to drink a shot of rum. I played a game like that the other night with him. It was like shaking dice and playing poker with dice, and I drank far too many times. So it's a bluffing game, and I don't lie very well. There, by as inebriated as I got, you could tell how honest a man I was. So Pure Love Ascension, good to see you. I'm glad to have you here tonight. And who else we got in here? We've got, let's see, I'm seeing lots of conversation going back and forth. Steve Clark, good to see you. Mandy Moo, good to see you as well. I think I'm in the wrong place. I should have turned left at Albuquerque, she says, somewhere along the way. You're in the right place for now, though. Camp out here for a while. Doug Stack, good to see you. Thanks for calling me lovely. That always makes me feel wanted and loved. Let's see who else we got. And I'm just going down through the list. I don't see Master Finn in here, unless he's in. Leslie Holker, good to see you. And, wow, Siani Reese is here. And Audrey is here. Audrica, good to see you. And Field Guy, there he is. And so I just want to say welcome to everybody. If I missed anybody, it's because it's not really a roll call. I just like to do that when we're live. I like to say good evening to everybody, let you know I know that you're here. Steph Cuervo Queen is here as well. And wouldn't you just like to have Antonio Banderas calling out your name? You know, Steph Cuervo Queen. I wish I could do his voice, but I can't. Matt is in the house. Good to see you, Master Finn. There, I see you now. Good to see you. Engineering, 100% on the reactor. Fantastic. All right, folks, I'm glad to have you all here tonight, and I appreciate you being here. Now, by the way, if there's anybody here and you are not a member of my YouTube channel, you can be. Just click on the little join button on the YouTube page that's down below the I think it's right below the window for the video. And if you see the join button, click on that. It's going to call up a window. It doesn't turn off the show or anything. You can see a little window. It'll give you 3 ways to become a member of this broadcast. Now, I will confess something to all of you who are members. I haven't done a whole lot about the premiums that come with being a member. And that's because I've been down here in the Makeshift Studio, in my makeshift life down in Louisiana. And it's made it a little tougher to get some of those things accomplished that I wanted to do. But fret not, they'll be coming. And, you know, if I was down here long enough, I'd probably sink in and have it all done already. But I feel I'm living in in-between land right now. And so getting some of those things done that I wanted to do, the extra videos, the ghost hunting and doing extra videos and putting them up, that's been a little harder to accomplish down here. So, of course, this all came up rather suddenly after I'd started doing the memberships. And so fret not, that will come. And do not let that dissuade you from wanting to become a member. It's coming. It's stuff that's coming. You all know. And so I will leave that at that. If you're not a member, go ahead and join up. It's fun to be a member. And I was doing the coffee morning shows at about 6 a.m. We could kick some of those back in. I've only done a couple since we've been down here, and that was for members only. And only members can come into that and see those. But then we end up opening it up anyway to get more people to come on in. And maybe halfway through the show, we'll open it up and let people come in. So we've got all that stuff going on. So there's my plug for tonight for joining up with the channel and becoming a member. And I appreciate it very much. And let's get into our topic. Now, this is a topic that I enjoy. I'm going to tell you, I've been on, if you've heard of George Norrie's Coast to Coast show, I've been on his show about 5 times, I think, over the last 10, 12 years. And the first time I was on, I think it was, somebody must have recommended me because I wasn't sure that he was sure what he was getting. I hadn't written any books yet other than The Rollicking Adventures of Tam O'Hare, which was a kid's book I had written a few years before that. And actually, it was much longer before that, 10 years before that. No, I take that back. Well, it was published in 2008, but I had written it in 98. And you all know the saga of that story, and I'll tell that again sometime for those of you who haven't heard it by the time when we have a chance to do that. So, hey, Alan Stiles, good to see you. I enjoy listening to you too. There we go. And Macabre Sterling, how you doing? Macabre Menace, good to have you in tonight. And so, the first time I was on George Norrie's show, Coast to Coast, they wanted to talk to me about the rollicking adventures of Tam O'Hare and fairy folk and ghost hunting, as somebody had obviously given my name to them. And so, and nobody's fessed up and said who it was, so I'm not quite sure who did that. But thank you if you're still sitting out there somewhere. And so George didn't know very much about me, and I listened to him off and on. And so we got to talking. We talked about the rollicking adventures of Tam O'Hare. We talked about the fairy folk and in relation to spirituality. And so we had a good time. He had me on for 3 hours, which was pretty cool. And I got the feeling I was a bit of filler at the beginning. It's like, we don't have anybody scheduled for this night. Let's get this guy. He can talk for 3 hours. And so it was fun. We had a good time. And of course, as my other books got published, I got to know George pretty well. And he had me on his show several more times. He came to speak at our Paradigm Symposium. And so it was great having George there. But I bring that up because I'm going to do a little reading to launch the show tonight, like we did last night. I read you Jamie Friel and the Young Lady, or Jamie Friel and the Fairies, as it was in the book on Celtic lore that was edited by William Butler Yeats in the last century. And I wanted to read the opening of The Rollicking Adventures of Tam O'Hare. Now, if you've been part of this, a listenership to this show, you've heard me read that before. As a matter of fact, I've read the whole book, and it's on my YouTube channel. If you scroll down the main video page, you'll see that it's down there, The Rollicking Adventures of Tam O'Hare. And I don't have the best mic here, so it doesn't pick up the resonance in my voice or anything. It's just the built-in mic because we're in the Makeshift Studio. But hopefully you'll enjoy this. And the reason I want to read this is going to be another short story that is a fairy story, not a fairy tale, but a story about the Fae, which we're going to talk about tonight. And I want to address a couple of things about the Fae tonight as well. And number one that I've heard many times is because they are spirit entities, that they're demonic and that there's something evil about them. So I want to address that a little bit tonight as well. And we'll talk about that. But first, I want to kind of wet your whistle, so to speak, for the topic, like we did last night with a little story. So sit back and hopefully enjoy this. And I'm going to read the prologue to The Rollicking Adventures of Tam O'Hare. Malcolm McDervish gripped the hilt of his sword tightly and kept very still, pulling the makeshift hood of his filet mort up over his head. Now, I got to say here, there's a glossary in the book. A filet mort is a great kilt. It's the big kilt that they could throw over the shoulder, make a hood out of it. And so he threw the hood of his filet mort up over his head. 3 soldiers were standing directly in front of the very bush in which he was hiding. And were they any closer, Malcolm could have reached out between the leaves and touched them. The sun was starting to set in the west, transforming the sky from deep azure blue to hues of gold and pink. In the bright slanted sunset light, Malcolm could see his own golden breath on the cooling air. He slowly inhaled and exhaled through his mouth with deliberate quietness, a skill he'd been developing for just such an occasion as this. Inside his leafy hiding place, he curled his body into a tight ball, pulling his knees up under his kilt. Then, wrapping the upper folds of wool around his arms and head, he hoped to blend in and remain unseen. Unseen, that is, until the perfect moment offered itself, allowing him to launch a surprise attack on the unsuspecting soldiers. He was lucky. The soldiers gave no indication that they even suspected he was there. They stood with their backs to him, engrossed, he imagined, in some frustrated conversation. To date, they had not yet been able to hunt down Malcolm McDervish, the hero of Glenborough, Scotland. This pleased Malcolm to no end, and he grinned gleefully in his silence. He wanted them to remain oblivious to his presence, knowing that he would need the element of surprise to be victorious against 3 professional soldiers. No, wait, not soldiers, knights. They were knights, he decided, evil knights who were there to attack the families of his clan while they slept in their beds that night. A good hero needs an equally bad enemy, so Malcolm decided that these knights were indeed heinously evil. If he could thwart their plans and slay them, Before they had a chance to attack his village of Glenborough, the name and deeds of Malcolm McDervish would be recited around the fires of his clan for generations to come. At that very moment, a sparrow landed on the hawthorn branch that hung low over the bush where Malcolm was concealed. He looked up at the bird and put a finger to his lips in a futile hope that the small bird would understand that it needed to keep quiet, making no noise that could possibly attract the evil knight's attentions. However, the motion of Malcolm's hand served only to startle the bird, who lit in a flourish and flew away in a fluster of flapping wings and falling feathers. "I'm doomed," Malcolm yelled inside his head, wincing and gritting his teeth at the sudden betrayal of his hiding place. "I'd best attack the now before all element of surprise has faded." And at that, Malcolm bellowed a horrifying war cry and leapt out of the bush with both hands gripping his sword high above his head. As he swung down toward the first of the evil knights, the blade of the sword hit the hawthorn branch above his head, sending the weapon flying out of control. Malcolm looked at his empty hands in horrified shock, glad that none of his friends were there to see him make such a bumbling maneuver. He then put his hands on his hips, tipped his head back, and laughed at the evil knights. "Think that's the end of me, eh?" he boomed. Then in one fluid motion, he tucked and rolled to the ground, snatching his sword from the dirt where it had fallen. While rolling back to his feet, he made a wicked slice toward one of the evil knights, taking his legs out from under him. Now back on his feet, Malcolm brandished his sword and without hesitation began hacking away at the two remaining evil knights. First a mighty blow to this one's head, then a hack to that one's ribs, and just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The three evil knights lay in a pile at Malcolm's feet. With a broad smile and a champion's bravado, Malcolm tipped his head back and howled the victor's cry, "Yally-hoo!" He then threw his wooden sword in the air and danced a victory jig, kicking in all directions the hawthorn sticks he had used to build his imaginary evil knights. It wasn't often that a 7-year-old hare saved his clan from destruction, and Malcolm was going to celebrate this one to the hilt. Too bad his friends weren't there to share in this glorious victory. Then it came, a wail on the wind, like a banshee keening out the death of some great Irish warrior. "Malcolm!" Malcolm slumped his shoulders. "Time to come in for your supper," the voice echoed from the glen in the valley below. "Very well, mother," Malcolm called back sullenly. And wasn't that the way it always was? Just when he was having the most fun, it was always time to come in for the night. Malcolm stooped and picked up his toy sword and one of the hawthorn twigs. "Tomorrow," he mused while pointing his wooden weapon at the scattered hawthorn sticks, "I'll come back with Hamish and Gregor, and we'll rebuild you evil knights, and then we'll have another go." Then, tucking his sword into his belt, he turned toward the cottages in the glen and began to walk home, whacking the tops of the long grass with the hawthorn twig as he went. As he passed through the grove near the tall blue-gray stones that stood on the bank of the stream, he thought he heard the sound of someone playing the pipes. The music didn't sound nearby, but seemed as if it was being carried on the air from some far-off place. Malcolm stopped to listen, cocking an ear slightly toward the sky. The pipes continued to play. The longer and louder they sounded, the more his memories were roused of frightening bedtime stories told by his parents, tales of the beautiful, mysterious musics that would fill the air on nights when the good people, the fairy folk of the Shadowlands, would appear. Malcolm froze. His heart was suddenly filled with fear, his eyes growing wide as the piping became distinct. The music was haunting and beautiful all at once. blending into the sound of the wind. It seemed as if the birds, the woods, and all creation had grown silent around him, save for the soft, sweet, lulling music of the pipes. The sun dropped out of sight, leaving a thin band of golden pink on the horizon's edge, while the rest of the sky melted into a deep, dark bluish black. Malcolm stood still and alone in the grassy field, wanting to run toward the cottages in the glen below, but somehow unable to move his feet. He was surrounded by a soft bluish light that came from somewhere behind him. The young hare, now wishing he had left for home much earlier, braved a glance back over his shoulder and saw what looked like flickering blue firefly-like orbs filling the air from the midst of the hawthorn grove. A shaft of light danced over his head, terrifying yet strangely more beautiful and serene than autumn moonlight. The bluish iridescence seemed to be alive, brimming full with shimmering wee folk, all riding the shaft of light as if it were a magic carpet dancing on the air. The little people all wore green scarves about their necks and shoulders in varying lengths, save for the one at the fore, who seemed to be leading the troop. Malcolm had never seen the good people before, to be sure, and he was overcome with a curiosity that would not allow him to succumb to his fright. He stood frozen in his place, crossed himself in Christian incantation, and watched the dancing fairy troop float low on the air. The fairy at the front of the troop was a good deal larger than the others, Malcolm observed, yet still about as small as a little child. She had bonny, long hair, bound about with a strap that glinted like the stars. She was more beautiful than any creature Malcolm had ever seen. Then something very strange happened. The beautiful fairy at the front turned aside and looked straight at Malcolm, who was immediately convinced he had lived his last day on this earth. Floating softly on the air before him, she stretched out her hand and touched her soft, cool fingers to his lips. Shh! Her whisper echoed softly into the mid-twilight mist, blending into the beautiful melancholy of the pipes. She gently took the hawthorn twig from Malcolm's hand, then turned and slowly floated back to the head of her troop. In a fluid motion, they all glided up and over the hedge of hawthorn trees, then down toward the smaller cluster of cottages in the glen below. Malcolm could not speak, nor think, nor move. His little body felt all at once light and heavy, and his legs buckled beneath him. Sinking slowly into the grass, he could see the first stars of the new night twinkling in the sky above him. He slowly closed his eyes and fell into a long, dark, peaceful sleep. And that, folks, is the prologue to the rollicking adventures of Tam O'Hare. And thank you, Leslie. There's the website for the book. And that is a fairy tale that I crafted for that book that was based on some of the old stories that I had heard and read. It's kind of an amalgam of different things from people who, living in Ireland and out in the back country of Ireland, had experiences with the Fae. And I borrowed some of the very language and the very things that they were saying in their stories, and I incorporated into that. And so I wanted to read that tonight to kick us off tonight on this little venture into the Fae. And so now the first thing I want to get into is, by the way, let me say hello, Mary Wins. Good to see you. Pure Love Ascension. I think I saw you earlier and said hi. And if anybody's come into the chat room, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here. I wanted to talk about something I left off with before I did the reading, and that is the negative connotation that you hear a lot of people say about the fairies. and about spirit beings and elementals altogether. And and before I get into that, by the way, remember I talked to you about Barry Fitzgerald, and many of you may remember or know who Barry Fitzgerald is. He has several books out. He's Irish and lives up above Dublin, and he is was on Ghost Hunters International. If you remember that show, he used to guest on Ghost Hunters, and then he was on Ghost Hunters International as the team lead. And after there was somebody else that was on before that, and why his name is not popping into my mind off the top of my head, I don't know. He'd be very insulted if I didn't remember that. And for some reason, quickly, but Barry became the lead investigator on that show. And Barry Fitzgerald's Iranian, says Doug Stack. Yeah, tell him that. And so I talked to him today, and he's going to come on May 4th. So it will be May 4th, I believe, is next Tuesday. And so, yes, because the 1st is on Saturday. So next Tuesday, the 4th, Barry's going to come on the show live, and he'll be in Ireland. So it'll be 3 a.m. for him there. And so I wanted to get him while we were in the middle of this series. But you know what? You know me. We'll make this series last until next Tuesday, and we'll crown it all off with Barry Fitzgerald. Because, by the way, you wouldn't know it right now by just listening to me, but if you were looking at my computer, I've got 8 tabs of things open of all different kinds of things that I want to cover tonight. And we're going to fit about a half of a tab into tonight. So I think we'll make it. So Barry Fitzgerald next Tuesday night is going to be on the show. And that's going to be a lot of fun. And what time will I be on again? Asked Macabre Menace. I don't know. What time is it in Osaka? You're still in Japan, right? So you're like Australian time or more, I think. Wouldn't it be like 2 in the afternoon? What is it there for you tonight in Osaka, Sterling? Is it like 2 p.m. right now? Something like that, 2:30? And so did I see Barbie D is here? Welcome, Barbie D. Good to have you on the show. I didn't say hi earlier. So I wanted to deal with this question a little bit about when we're talking about the fairy folk. Now, when I talk to people here in the United States on this show, there's a lot of people that are thinking outside the box that are not necessarily within traditional religions or denominations anymore, since they've grown up. They're free thinkers, you might say. Some people would call that dangerous right off the bat from within the church or the synagogue. However, if you grew up Christian, if you're still in a Christian setting, you've probably heard when the topic comes up that things like ghosts, talking about ghosts, well, that's all demon, that's all from Satan. The same thing with fairy folk and the fae and the spirit beings and the elementals, that these are all very bad things, that they're things of the devil. Scotty, we're talking about the ones who scare kids at the local library. Are you talking about what, fairies? Maybe not. Maybe a different kind. Hey, Amanda B in Australia, good to see you from down under. And that's as good as my Australian gets. Sorry. Crikey. So good to have you here tonight. So the fairies are beings who occupy this middle realm between the heavens and the earth, if you will. And fairies have these magical powers. They're sometimes associated with demons and fallen angels. And in lore, they're capable of bewitchment and possession, and that requires an exorcism of sorts. And so the church for centuries believed that the Fae actually existed. They didn't say they were fake. They said they existed, but they relegated them to the realm of Satan. They were things of Satan. They were dark beings. They were nigh unto demonic. And fairy, the word originates from the Latin word fata, or fate. And it evolved from fairy, a state of enchantment. And according to lore, the fairies themselves don't much like the word fairy. They prefer to be called more respectful names, such as the good neighbors, the gentry, the people of peace, the strangers, themselves, as they might say, and then themselves showed up, the Seelie court or the blessed court, and other terms, the good people, the little people, the wee folk, the good folk. And in medieval times, fairy sometimes described women who had magical power. She's a fae. And so the idea that fairies were evil was something that came out of the church. The little people, says Leslie Holker. Exactly. Audrey says 3 Aussies and a blue alien. Is that what we got in the chat room now? I like the fae myself. So do I, Siani. And the fae, the fairy is, we spell fairy tales. We talked about this a bit last night. Fairy. They become fairy tales, like a fair. That's not really the etymology of the word, but the way it's spelled. And yet I like the fae, the Fae. So it's Faerie, the fairies. And now there's origins. The fairy beliefs are universal and they're ancient. And there's this variety of explanations as to their origins. So Celtic fairy lore is particularly strong and it's absorbed Christian elements. So the Celtic fairy lore has taken the Fae and absorbed really the Christian elements once Ireland was Christianized. And in Irish lore, the fairies are descended from the Tuatha De Danann, which we mentioned last night, and the early inhabitants of Ireland. And when the Mill invaded, M-I-L, the Mill invaded, the Tuatha De Danann used supernatural powers to become invisible and withdraw into the hollow hills. And from there, them arose the gods, the demigods, the heroes, and the fairies. And other explanations for origins of fairies are the following here. I've got a bunch of them here. Pardon me. I do have a cough button now, but I didn't use it. Souls. Now, other explanations of the fairies. They're souls of the unbaptized and the pagan dead that are trapped between heaven and earth. So now you see there's a very Christianized explanation for the source of fairies, the unbaptized. Were there fairies then before 0 AD, the transition from BCE to CE or BC to AD in that period of time? Because to be baptized, you would have to be a follower of Christ. And so for the last 2,000 years is all they existed, according to that theory. If you were unbaptized, if you were a pagan and you died, you were trapped between the heavens and the earth. And that, of course, goes to something that the show is not about at all, a different topic, but the topic of baptism. So you can tell that this was a theory that was put forward by the church which taught infant regeneration or baptismal regeneration, meaning that baptism saved you and it did something for you of a spiritual nature that elevated your soul to be something closer to God. So that if the souls of the unbaptized died, they were trapped between heaven and earth and they became like the elementals and the fae, which I would think would be pretty erroneous theory. That's just something put forward by the church. Baptism isn't something even biblically that saved the soul. It was just a picture of accepting the belief of following Jesus. That's why I never believed in infant baptism. Now we do that as a dedication sometimes. You can anoint a child and so on. But that's not what baptism is scripturally. If you're following the scripture in a church, you would have to dig in for yourself and you'll find that the word baptize isn't even the word that's there in the original Koine Greek. Is where you take the Greek word and phonetically make it into an English word. So the Greek word for what we see as baptize is baptizo. And baptizo, by definition, means immersion, dunking under the water and bringing back up out of the water. So baptize in the Bible actually is the word baptizo, and it means immersion. But they did not translate in the 1611 version of the Bible, written by King James, the King James Version. They didn't use the word immersion because of the politics of the church. So they transliterated baptizo into baptize rather than translate it and use the word immerse. So you have baptizo. So the souls of the unbaptized, the unimmersed, and the pagan dead trapped between heaven and earth. Hey, Siani, that's okay. I was Ukrainian Orthodox when I was a little kid, but not by choice. It's because my stepfather was Ukrainian Orthodox. Then I became a Baptist for many years, then evangelical Christian for many years following that. And so now, yeah, Greece didn't have a name until the 1800s. It's true. So this was called, it was called Koine Greek, or it was Hellenized Greek. Hellenization, of course, as we all know historically, before the time of Christ, the earth was Hellenized. And the language that was spoken was a Hellenized language. It was Koine, which today we would call ancient Greek. So now let's move on from that point. Another source, they say, of the Fae were the guardians of the dead, living in another world that exists between the living and the dead. And they have the power to take people, when they do, those people can die. So they were considered to be guardians, almost like the guardians of your soul. And they could come and take you off of the living plane and into the medium plane in between. They were also thought to be ancestral ghosts. They were thought to be fallen angels that were cast out of heaven with Lucifer, sentenced by God to the elements of the earth, where they act as demons or demonics. Now, there is a passage in the book of Enoch, and in the book of Enoch, and I wrote about this in The Rise and Fall of the Nephilim, toward the very end of the book. I said, where are they today? Well, according to the book of Enoch, when the flood came, the great deluge of Noah, and it wiped out the earth and all the inhabitants on the earth. Remember when we talked about the flood, we said the flood, as we were erroneously taught in Sunday school or Christian theology, they say that the flood came because of what? The wickedness of mankind. That God brought the great flood to wipe out the wickedness of man. But when in reality, when you go back to the texts, the Hebrew of the language of the texts, it talks about how these Nephilim, these watchers who intermingled with the daughters of men, and the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, that the great flood was brought to wipe out the evil that and the wickedness that had been brought to humanity and tainted the bloodlines of humanity. And so we had all this hybrid race going on. So God wiped it all out. Now Enoch says that it's the spirits of those Nephilim who were killed during the great deluge that became the demons, the evil spirits that would plague mankind throughout time. And so that's another thought, is that another theory on this is that the Fae are the fallen Nephilim, the spirits of the Nephilim. And by the way, if they come back as evil spirits and they come back to do evil upon mankind, they're the demonics. I don't think they're the same thing as the Fae, but this is the theory of saying that they were the fallen angels cast out of heaven. Another theory says that their source was nature's spirits, who are attached to the particular places or to the four elements. For example, sylphs of the air, gnomes of the earth, undines of the water, and salamanders of fire. They're also called supernatural creatures who are shape-shifting monsters or half human, half monster. Still another would say they're small human beings, primitive races like the Tuatha De Danann that went into hiding in order to survive in more recent times. And fairies have been compared to extraterrestrials. Have you seen that? That there were some of the elementals, drawings people would come up with of elementals, and the experiences people have had actually seeing elementals. That and they very comparative to what we would call alien grays, that kind of look and so on. So now this is very subjective, but um, this is how this stuff starts to link together in light. And it's kind of a light version of this. Thank you, Therese. Yes, I'm going to discuss the Nephilim on Friday night at Andromeda 7 Celestial Gateway. So I'm looking forward to that. It'll be Friday at 8 o'clock Central Standard Time, 9 o'clock Eastern, or 6 o'clock West Coast time for Audrey. So Durwood is here. Good to have you here, Durwood. Nice to see you. Slightly Slanted Sleuth. Good to see you as well, my alliterated friend. All right, and so now let's get into some of the descriptions and the characteristics of the fairies. Now, fairies usually, now see, even saying the word, we get a chuckle out of the word fairy, because as you know, in the vernacular, in a derogatory, we have attached the word fairy to homosexuality. Oh, he's such a fairy. And hey, my brother and sister fairies, so we've done that for years and years. That is there. So we got to get that let's get that out of the bag, because everybody knows that that's been a slang word used to derogatorily speak about gay people. The word fairy also conjures up images of Tinkerbell. And I see my kids watch these animated shows, 3D animated shows on Disney that are built off of Tinkerbell and her community of fairies that she lives with. And so is very interesting stuff. And yes, I will be, Siani, I am doing a second edition of the Rise and Fall of the Nephilim. My publisher, New Page Books, contacted me a long time back, and we finally got it, the deal put to bed a few weeks ago. I'm going to be writing an updated version of the Rise and Fall of the Nephilim. Not a lot. We're not rewriting the whole book. It's going to be a second edition of the book, and I'm going to add a chapter or two and make a bunch of chapter notes throughout the book and things like that. So it should be fun. And that's coming up. And you probably won't see it until next summer in publishing, because by the time I finish it, it won't go to press till after the new year. So there you go. Just a side note, since Siani mentioned it. So now the fairies are usually they're invisible, save to those with clairvoyant sight of some sort. And this is iced tea, in case anybody's wondering. They're best seen at dusk, and in lore, they don't even like to be seen by people at all. And they're often are going to punish people who see them accidentally, including striking them blind. And if they chose to be visible, fairies can bestow the gift of clairvoyance and healing upon mortals. And descriptions of fairies cover a wide range, from the tiny lights to winged creatures, most often the small people. And they tend to be either ugly, even monstrous, or quite the opposite, very beautiful. And they're shapeshifters who can assume whatever form they wish, especially to deceive or to manipulate people. In Ireland, fairies assume the forms of blackbirds, especially crows. In French fairy lore, there's sometimes magpies. Blackbirds, as well as black animals, are associated with demons and the devil. And some fairies are solitary, like leprechauns. Leprechauns! while others live in races and nations. Their homes are often in the earth and are accessed through mounds, fairy mounds. You've heard of the fairy caves, the fairy burrows, fairy rings, the fairy holes in the ground and under piles of stones and rocks. And it's bad luck to disturb these places. And the fairies will take revenge on people who do, causing misfortune, illness, and even death. Now, when I had my ranch back where I told you last night, we left some offerings on the four corners of our ranch. And we were back in the wooded area, and there was about maybe 6 to 8 acres of the land that had woods that grew in off from beyond our fences and overtook into the pastures and the hills. And so we had this about 6 to 8 acres of wooded area. And we went back in there exploring once, and I had a friend who was into all this stuff at the time. And he looked and he said, "Look, you've got a fairy ring here." And it was mushrooms that were all grown in a big, wide, about a 8-foot diameter circle. Now, I don't know if they grow naturally that way. I said to him, "That's a fairy ring?" I said, "Don't they just grow naturally that way?" And I didn't know. I was just asking. But there was a big circle, singular circle of mushrooms out in the woods. Now, maybe some of you can tell me whether or not they actually grow that way. I have no idea. So, but he called it a fairy ring. And he said, "Don't walk through it, walk around it." And so we always did. Now, the land of the fairy, also called Elfland, how original is that, has characteristics of the land of the dead. And time is altered so that the day in a human life might stretch into years in fairyland. And there's no day or night, but a perpetual twilight. And in legend and lore, there's an intermingling of ghosts of the dead and the afterlife with fairies and the lord of the fairies. Now, descriptions of European fairies have been collected from all kinds of oral lore all around the world. Robert Kirk, a Scottish Episcopalian minister who was clairvoyant, visited fairyland and wrote an account. The Secret Commonwealth, he called it, in 1691 and 1692. And it's still one of the major first-person accounts in existence of a human's encounter with the Fae. And a major compendium of fairy lore was written by Y.W. Evans Wentz in the early 20th century, and the Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries. And that's a book I was looking at before last night's show. I was going to use some of that, but it was so thick and heavy and so lengthy that I didn't know where to begin with that. So I just thought I'm going to pull some references from this instead. But the Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries. He wrote that in 1911. And so fairies live pretty much the way humans do. They work and maintain families. They amuse themselves with food, drink, music, dancing. Like in Jamie Freel and the Young Lady last night, when Jamie Freel comes in and they're all dancing and drinking and playing music. And they travel in the physical world along paths and tracks and raths, which, as with their homes, must never be disturbed or destroyed by humans. And some of them like to march in processions at night, especially at the cross-quarter days of the seasons. If someone builds a house atop a fairy track, the fairies will pass right through it. And the occupants will sicken, their crops will fail, and their animals will die. And the fairies act as kind of these like poltergeists. They open and closed windows and doors, creating disturbances, and similarly to haunting ghosts. Fairies are similar to demons in that many of them don't even care for humans at all. And sometimes they'll deliberately fool and attack people. A strong trickster element runs through fairy lore. They're fond of leading travelers astray. They attend human wakes and funerals and eat the banquet food and the spoiling of other people. So these are some of the stories that are connected to the fairies. The fairies kidnap people to their abodes, especially beautiful girls and women. and they take them for wives. In the fairy land, or Tir na Nog, a person who eats their food remains trapped in another world. To be taken by the fairies means to go to the other world, also the land of the dead. And if an abduction is temporary, a person sickens and then they recover. And if it's permanent, the person dies and stays in the other world. So eating fairy food is taboo, and it's going to alter the body and prevent a person from returning to the world of the living. In the story of Tam O'Hare, I have him in the Faerie Realm seeking the little girl who's been stolen. And he drinks some of their wine. And he feels as though he's been there for an afternoon and an evening, but he finds he's been gone for over 9 months. And because he's in this constant state, this constant twilight world, this beautiful world where there's eating and dancing and revelry and fun and drink and so on. And I wish I had that in front of me now. I'd read you that little segment here. As a matter of fact, in the rollicking adventures of Tam O'Hare, let's see here. I can find it for you really quick. Here it is. It goes like this in this story. Now, I've read this to you before. So Tam has to pass himself 3 times through the stone with the hole in it, the hole in the stone, the Manentol. And 3 times he walks through, steps to the other side, comes back around, steps through again. And 3 times Tam repeated under his breath as he slowly turned away and stepped closer to the stone. He threw a quick glance back over his shoulder at Horatio and the old badger. These are characters that you know. If you haven't heard this before, no context for you, but that's who he was there with. He then stooped down and stepped through the opening onto the other side of the stone. He walked back around to the front of the stone and stepped through again, all the while thinking of Brindolin, the missing girl, and how frightened she must be. When he emerged on the other side, he turned and came around to the front once again, glancing at the 2 standing on the shore. He hesitated for a brief moment. The sound of the loch and the greenwood blended into the ethereal sound of the pipes that had now grown even more distinct, filling the air around him. Tam stepped up and through the stone's hewn-out center for the 3rd time, and the final time. And when he passed to the other side, the woods were suddenly filled with a light, low, nearly transparent mist that floated just below Tam's knees. He turned back around to the front of the stone. His squire and the old badger were gone. The sun was glinting off the loch, tinting everything a golden hue. The trees were lush with bright colors of autumn. The sad, sweet pipes were now no longer merely a distant sound echoing over the waters of the loch, but they melted into the hum of the very essence of the world around him. Tam wasn't sure if they were really even there, or if the wind was playing tricks on his ears, but he felt as if he could touch the very music with the tips of his fingers and taste the notes on his tongue. He closed his eyes, turned his face skyward, and breathed in deep, filling his lungs, it seemed, as if for the first time. Now you'll recognize this, by the way, from Jamie Friel and the Fairies. "Welcome, Tam. Welcome, Tam O'Hare. Welcome, welcome," came several small voices from behind him. He turned and saw a group of tiny people who looked like young children, yet smaller. The tallest of them came no higher than Tam's waist, and they all gathered around him with genuine smiles. The wee folk took Tam by the hands and led him along a path through the woods away from the loch. All the while they asked him joyously if he would join them in feasting and dancing. "I would love nothing better," Tam said, with happiness flooding his heart. Up ahead, Tam could see a clearing in the wood, with an enormous fire burning in the center. Hundreds of the good people were dancing in a ring around the fire. singing along with the tune the pipes were echoing in the wood. As Tam entered the clearing, the wee folk who had greeted him broke off and ran in all directions, some to the dance and others to the sprawling, ornately carved oaken tables filled with every sort of delicious food and drink imaginable. Several of the dancers came to Tam and pulled him into the ring where he joined hands and kicked up his feet, singing along with the rest of them. And he danced, and he danced, and danced for what seemed like hours. Yet he never grew tired or weary. He went to tables and ate and drank, singing songs, not caring how he knew the words. But he danced some more, and he was filled with happiness, beyond happiness, really. For the first time in his life, he was filled with joy. The sky glowed with golden hues, and pink, billowy clouds floated over the treetops. With a handful of grapes and a goblet of sweet wine, Tam walked down the path to the shore of the loch and sat on the hillside. There were wee folk lazing all around him, and the peaceful, sweet pipes wafted on the gentle breeze. Tam had never been happier or more filled with peace at any time in his life. He drank deeply from his goblet, draining it. Then, after setting it down on the grass beside him, he lay his head back and looked into the clouds where he watched a white bird floating gracefully on the breeze. He blinked twice, sat up and looked toward the loch, elbow on his bent knee, and then he saw her. Sitting on the ground before the old standing stone was little Brindolin. She had several of the wee folk around her, and she was playing a wooden flute for them as they sat quietly listening. Tam stood to his feet and moved toward the girl, drawn by the lulling peacefulness of the flute. The music was beautiful. Ah, me, Tam said with a soft smile. If only your grandfather could hear you play such beautiful music. And in that instant his wits came rushing back to him. The beauty and peace of this place had charmed him, and until this very moment he had lost all sense of why he had come. He stepped closer to Brindolin and knelt down beside her. Reaching up, he gently took the flute from her hands. She smiled at him. Why, hello, Cousin Tam, she said, in a crisp little voice that sparkled like the sun on living water. Hello, my sweet, said Tam, tears flooding his eyes. I've come to bring you home. And she looked around a bit confused, then back at Tam. But I am home, cousin, she said cheerily. Tam took her by the hands and said gently, No, my little bird, I mean home, to your family at Glenborough. Brindolin furrowed her brow a bit, then a smile slowly filled her little face. Oh, Grandfather Whitebeard, she exclaimed. I remember and Sister Abigail and Mother. The little girl's entire essence seemed to smile at Tam, who could only but smile back with all his heart. Then suddenly, and with some sense of urgency, she pulled her hands out of Tam's and stood to her feet. Turning to a nearby bush of yellow roses, she reached in, avoiding the thorns, and plucked a single blossom. She turned back to Tam and tenderly took his hand in hers, upturning his palm. In his hand she placed the delicate yellow rose. Give this to my sister, for I ken that you love her, the wee girl said brightly. And tell all my family that I love them too, with all my heart. Tam looked at the rose in his hand, and a strange thing started to happen. He could see through his hand to the ground below. Then, looking at Brindolin, he could see the hazy loch through her as she began to dissolve before his very eyes. All around him, the wee folk were sweetly saying, Goodbye, Tam O'Hare, goodbye. Do come again, Tam O'Hare, when you can stay and dance with us some more. Tam looked at Brindolin, who was almost a mist. No, don't go. Come with me, lass, he cried. I cannot, cousin. I belong here, she replied. The wee rose will live as long as ye ne'er let it touch the ground, cousin. Her voice echoed off till it was as thin as the evening mist. Be happy, Cousin Tam. Be happy. Be happy. Then she was gone. Tam sat all alone on the shore of Loch Tay. The air was cool and crisp and blue, and the sun was rising over the eastern hills. He wondered if he'd been dreaming, but there was the yellow rose in the palm of his hand. He was still on his knees in front of the old standing stone. He looked, but McNutt and the old badger were nowhere waiting where he had left them. They must have taken shelter for the night. Had it been all night long, he thought? In his heart, he felt that he had broken his word to Uncle Argyle, and it was going to break Abigail's heart. He had failed, and little Brindlin was still under the enchantments of the good people. She was gone from them, and there was nothing Tam nor anyone could do. He sat on the ground, his back against the standing stone, and with his face in his hands, he wept. And high on the air the pipes lilted softly, and never was piping so sad, and never was piping so sweet. So, folks, that is one of the encounters. And again, when I wrote Tam O'Hare, I incorporated a lot of the lore that I had read and the accounts that I had read and the stories I had read to create that scene of the fairies, and the fairy kingdom, and the fairy realm. So sometimes eating the fairy food was what I was on, would be taboo, for it would alter the body or prevent a person from returning to the world of the living. And in this case, I have young Brindlin just so enchanted by the place that he did not want to return. And Tam, in a sense, was sent back. And he finds, in what he thought was that evening of dancing and so on, that he was gone for 9 months. So, not all fairies are hostile, and not all of them are tricksters. Some are kind and helpful to people, though on conditions. The household brownies will help with chores, as long as the occupants are respectful. Leave out milk and cream and food for them, and aren't messy. And once food is left for the Fae, it must not be eaten by man or beast, for the fairies take the essence of the food, and it's no longer fit for others to consume. And if food falls on the floor, the fairies claim it, and it must be given to them. And the fairies have a major weakness: iron, which repels them and dilutes their supernatural powers. Amulets made of iron keep fairies away. Now, there's more I want to talk about. I want to talk about bewitchment and witchcraft and changelings, which is a big part of the Tam O'Hare story. Possession and exorcism, and fairies in contemporary lore. I want to get to all those. These are all my talking points for tonight, but we're not going to make those. I did say I made a post tonight, and I said I wanted to talk about the different kinds of plants that you could put in your garden. I put up a short list of plants that attract fairies to your garden. Now, here's the big question, and we didn't get to the prelude of this before I got into why you would want to attract fairies. But if they're evil and if they're bad and they can do bad things, do you want them around? Do you want these elemental spirits around your home? Do you want them in your garden? We're going to talk about that tomorrow night. But I'll tell you, there's a short list here: the common yarrow, and I won't give you the Latinizing, the Achillea milliefolium, and the New York aster, the Aster novi belgi. Let's skip the genus names. New York aster, the Shasta daisy, the Western giant hyssop or the horsemint, French lavender, rosemary, thyme. We have rosemary and thyme in our front herb garden, and amongst other things, if you know what I mean. Fountain butterfly bush, orange eye butterfly bush, summer lilac, shrubbery, cinquefoil, or cinquefoil, I guess it is. Common garden petunias, verbenas and vervains, pincushion flowers, cosmos, and common zinnia. These are things that they love. They also love foxglove and primrose and ragwort, cowslips, pansies, bluebells, clover, three-leaf, not four-leaf clover, three-leaf clover, St. John's wort, hazel, rowan, blackthorn, oak, willow, elder, birch, alder, apple, ash, and especially toadstools. Hence the fairy ring out in my forest. And there's ways to dedicate your fairy gardens. We won't get into that tonight. And but you're welcoming them to be there. And because once you have a garden and it's started, and you plant these things in your garden, you might want to ritually dedicate it as a fairy garden sanctuary. Now, keep in mind, you're not just planting flowers and thinking, oh, there's these imaginary, like Santa Claus, things that come along. And but what you're doing is you're actually attracting something that is an elemental, that is a spirit being. Guys, you go right ahead and help yourselves, okay? Whatever you need to do. You need to use the shower or anything, it's right through there. Guys, we have some people staying in our camper tonight, so I just had to make mention of them as they walked in. So, so once the garden's started, you might want to ritually dedicate it. If you want to dedicate it as a fairy garden sanctuary, begin by walking around the garden with an athame, and it's pointed at its boundaries. Athame being like a dagger, and you point it at the boundaries, much like casting a circle. You sprinkle the perimeter of the garden with a branch of fir dipped in salted spring water. And finally, you walk the boundaries of the garden with a lighted incense stick, and it can be left to burn in the ground when you finish. And then a wand of hazel. Slowly walk around the garden and greet each plant with words like spirits of the apple, spirits of the zinnia, spirits of the cosmos. You speak to each one. I welcome your presence in the garden. The spirits of these plants. Feel your love flow from your heart down to your wand and out the end of the wand. This hazel wand that you've got. Be sure to welcome all the plants and the stones and the trees. Nature spirits are easily offended, believe it or not. And conclude your ritual with these words. In the name of the goddess and the god, I declare this garden a sanctuary for the spirits of nature and the children of the gods. And when you're finished, leave a gift. Cookies, soda, ale, cream, or bright, shiny things like rings, beads, or stones. So there are things you can look at and to look at more about this stuff. We'll talk about that more tomorrow. Now, am I telling you these things as a going belief system that you need to, I don't know, abandon certain belief systems you have about things? But no, I'm bringing this up to say that sometimes what our belief systems may have said about these beings might be based solely in politicalized theology. And so what you're doing with this is you're acknowledging the fact that these spirits are there. You're not worshiping them. If anybody thinks, well, that's idolatry, you're worshiping something. You're not. You're welcoming them to your garden. You're acknowledging their presence in the world and their presence in your neighborhood or your yard or your land. And so Matt Finn said I wanted to get my little girl into a play fairy garden she can design and take care of. I think that would be fun intro to reading her Tamo hair. Yeah, maybe so. Matt Finn, maybe so. I was so mad at the town was trimming trees hanging over the road in front of my house today. They need to do that when the trees are hibernating, not when they have leaves on them, so Doug Stack. You're absolutely right. Roger Rabbit, very good to see you. I didn't see you earlier tonight. I said, this topic is very intriguing. I'm enjoying it. Kinsey needs to hear about these fairies. Yeah. And you know, you want to be careful not to tamper with things the wrong way. So there are ways to do these things, and I don't even know all of them. I would have to talk to somebody or go look things up and do my research. But welcoming the Fae into blessing your home. Blessing, meaning it's your land, your yard, if you will, or your land if you have more than that. You bless them and you welcome them in to come in and bless your land and bless you. And you acknowledge who they are and that they're there, and you don't do anything to offend them. Do you think for a minute that elemental spirits care whether or not you believe Christian or Jewish or Arabic or any other, or Muslim or any kind of other theology? They are who they are, and they exist. And the reason we balk at their existence is because our society tells us these things can't be so. We're a secularized society. We don't believe those things anymore. Oh, such superstitions. But I can tell you, I know these things exist. Now, you don't have to take my word for it. I'm just telling you the story. I'm talking about it. I'm not a weirdo. I'm not entrapped in some kind of weird religious mumbo jumbo or ritual things or black magic or anything. I acknowledge that things exist, though. I acknowledge that ghosts or spirits exist because I've seen them, I've encountered them. Same thing with the fairy folk and the fae. I think they've been around for a very long time. Hey, Johan, I see your name being spoken, so I know you're out there somewhere. Gaza Cave, good to see you. Cav, Gaza Cav. Good to see you in here. And so there you go, folks. That's all I got for tonight. We're going to talk some more about this tomorrow, Wednesday night. We're going to hit some other aspects of this. Again, I mentioned some of the things we're going to hit. We're going to talk about Beltane, and we're going to talk about Midsummer. These are considered to be two of the best times to actually make contact with the Fae. Now, do you know when Beltane is? We hear that word all the time, Beltane. Do you know when it is? Saturday. It's May 1st is Beltane. And then we have also Midsummer, which is the Midsummer Equinox. It's the 21st of June. Or is it the 20th? I'll look that up and make sure. It's not the night of the 20th into the 21st, or the 21st, and so on. So thank you, Barbie D. And Leslie, thank you for being here. Good night, everybody. I'm glad you all came in. That's right, Steve. They've been here longer than mankind. Gaza Cave in Australia, from New Zealand. Oh, good to have you here, Gaza. I'm glad to have you here. Somebody else from way down on the other side of the planet from where I am. So I'd love to have summer, said Leslie Holker. It's coming. May 1st is Beltane, the beginning officially of summer and the planting season. So there you go. All right, folks. I want to thank you for being here. Thank you, Matt Finn. You have a great evening as well. And we'll see you here tomorrow night. And, you know, as always, I just want to say, live long and prosper. And you folks, you have a good night. We'll see you tomorrow.
You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.